How can an island rebuild its electric grid in a way that revives the local economy? Marcel Castro Sitiriche is the Co-director of Cohemis at the University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez. In September 2017, his home of Puerto Rico suffered a historic blackout when struck by Hurricane Maria, in part due to years of mismanagement by the local electric utility. He's developed a unique perspective on how to address Puerto Rico's vulnerability to hurricanes and how to build a more resilient and renewable electricity system. I'm John Farrell, Director of the Energy Democracy Initiative at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and this is Local Energy Rules, a podcast sharing powerful stories about local renewable energy. Welcome, Marcel.
Thank you for having me here.
I think most people are familiar because it was such a big news story at the time that the power was out for a long time on Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria struck in September 2017. I was hoping that you could start us off by helping people understand a few reasons that it took nearly a year to reconnect power to the last customer when the same hurricane also hit Florida, but power was restored much more quickly.
Yeah, this is a very important question and something that I have looked at, experiencing part of the blackout. I recovered the power in my house 90 days after Hurricane Maria. But the reasons are many, but there is one particular one that affects us. That is the system is centralized. And the system in other places are also centralized, but the centralized nature in Puerto Rico plays a major role in terms of recovering back. Now, there are other reasons why it took much longer than other places. For example, even before Hurricane Maria, PREPA was already diminished by austerity measures. So there were less things in stock to replace poles and materials, and also there was less personnel working with PREPA as compared to 20 years ago when Georges impacted us. Another important thing is that Maria was very strong. When it got to Florida, it was not as strong as when it hit Puerto Rico. And just looking at the average wind speed over land that the Impact Lab estimated throughout the whole Puerto Rico land area, only 5 storms were more intense than Maria, and they were all in the Pacific Ocean. That is from the 1950s until now. So when we look at that, it was a very strong hurricane. Also, the devastation due to trees falling and landslides. There were thousands of landslides all across Puerto Rico, but particularly in the center of the island where recovery efforts took longer to get and restoration took months, almost a year. In addition to that, we had a slow start. Government didn't call for mutual aid for more than a month. It took 6 weeks for the government to call on mutual aid assistance, and that hampered the recovery efforts in the beginning. The official version is that the private companies could jump in without matching or putting some money up front from the Puerto Rico government side, but there might be other issues involved. For example, the idea to make PREPA private. And I think everybody was aware that whoever restore your power is going to have a great impact on your mentality, on your perception of who helped you recover power. Is it a public power utility in the U.S., or is it a private utility? And I think that played a role in that decision. But I'm speculating about that, but it's possible. The other thing is that we are a remote island, so the support crews could not drive from other states to help Puerto Rico, so they had to take come by boat, and that takes longer, it's more expensive. So that's another thing that limited the quick response that sometimes the states get. And finally, the rough terrain. The rural mountain areas are really hard to get because the PREPA workers were less, so the people coming from places like Florida, they don't have experience with these mountain terrains that you can find in Jayuya, Orocovis, Utuado, and that is something that also, I think, play a major role in the what I call is the longest blackout ever in the world. That I have never heard of a power outage that lasts 329 days.
That leads me to one of the questions I had about something that you're looking at, which is kind of a novel perspective on how we might approach the solution. So there's been lots of talk, you mentioned about privatizing the utility PREPA that had been happening even before the hurricane, but is now a big discussion. There's a lot of conversation about microgrids, and I'll ask you in a little bit later about some new rules that the island's Energy Bureau has come up with for these miniature grids. But you've created a pretty interesting document looking at the problem by focusing on the hours of lost electricity. So you just mentioned it was the longest blackout ever. Tell me a little bit more about what you've been trying to track in terms of how this blackout impacted, and then how that's allowing you to focus on solving this problem in a different way.
Yes. Actually, the first time I read about the customer hours of lost electricity service was a report by Rhodium Group that they mentioned that already by October, so a little bit more than a month after Hurricane Maria, they already estimated that the Hurricane Maria created the largest blackout in U.S. history. Now, so there's a difference between the biggest or the largest with the longest, right? You can have a very long blackout for a few people. That doesn't make it the biggest. So the good thing of using customer hours of lost electricity service is that you take in consideration massive blackouts that sometimes leaves millions of people without power for a few hours, but also you can compare that with maybe smaller amount of people or customers losing power, but for extended periods of time. So when we look at the customers' hours of lost electricity service, which I call choles, to make it short, Hurricane Maria was already above 1,200,000 choles on October 2018. And by April, Rhodium Group reported that it was already the second largest blackout in the world. Only Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines had more than 6,000 choles. But we have to keep in mind that the Philippines has a population of 100 million people as compared to the less than 4 million people in Puerto Rico. So then I started looking at how this could be used to make better decisions, and also now how to best distribute the recovery funds that we hope at some point get to the people that need it the most. And that brings some interesting numbers. For example, I divided the groups of customers in Puerto Rico in three, and the last 200,000 customers that represent 14% of the total of the customers of PREPA contributed about a third of the total choles, which are about 3,000. In my estimate, I have a conservative estimate of 3,000, but other estimates put it more like 3,400 million choles. I have about 3,000 million. And so it is a lot. I estimated 928,000 million choles for only those 200,000 customers that spent more than 5 months without electricity. Now, when we think of what should we do and how much it will cost to fix that vulnerability, we should keep in mind that with Hurricane Georges, the estimated total number of customers' hours of lost electricity service is about 1,000 million. So it's very close. For the whole Hurricane Georges that devastated Puerto Rico in 1998 is very close to the last 200,000 families, the last one that recovered power after Hurricane Maria. And to put that in context with other events, with Sandy, there were 775 million choles. With Hugo in 1989, that's the first one I remember, in Puerto Rico, it was about 700 million choles. And with Katrina, for example, it was 681 million choles. So when we put that in context, I think that the numbers are really mind-blowing, and we need to really think how to best invest to cover the vulnerability of these last 200,000 families, but also all Puerto Rico.
And so what you have put together is a suggestion that we focus on, in terms of addressing those families, that we look at solar and battery installations for those folks as a way of both distributing renewable energy systems. It's a way to use recovery dollars that will focus on the folks that are hardest to reach in the long run, who suffered the most from the hurricane, and also can be deployed relatively quickly, which is important because, of course, another hurricane season is coming in just a few months, and there's no way of knowing whether or not there's another Maria in store for Puerto Rico.
Exactly. I think we have an opportunity. The problem with opportunities is that they are that, right? So if the opportunity could be taking advantage of, or it can become a lost opportunity. And now we have the opportunity to use the recovery funds that should come to help have more resilient communities. I'm focusing on the area of energy, but it should apply to other things too, in having water and food and shelter. But in terms of energy, we can cover that vulnerability with technology that is also going to support a more sustainable community in the long term, because then you're going to have a locally generated energy at a competitive price or a competitive cost that is much more resilient in the case of a strong hurricane coming. This is important because it could give us a window into the future, what would be needed in other places in the United States afterward. We have two specific issues to address that are particular to Puerto Rico, and that is the vulnerability to hurricanes and also the high cost of electricity from the grid. Now, there are projections. For example, Homer Energy and Rocky Mountain Institute did a work on grid defection, the economics of grid defection, and they predicted that in a couple of decades, there are many cities that are going to be challenged, or the utility model is going to be challenged in those cities by decreasing price of solar with storage. Now, that already happened in Hawaii, and it is happening now in Puerto Rico. If we do things right in Puerto Rico, it could serve as a model for other cities to follow, especially when solar with batteries become a real challenge to the grid. And we don't need to make it all cutthroat competition. We should try to collaborate and make the transition to what makes more sense for the customers and for the families.
We're going to take a short break. When we return, we'll discuss a bill being described as Puerto Rico's Green New Deal and how the island has already created more local accountability and policies to enable local energy production. Hey, thanks for listening to Local Energy Rules. If you've made it this far, you're obviously a fan, and we could use your help for just 2 minutes. As you've probably noticed, we don't have any corporate sponsors or ads for any of our podcasts. The reason is that our mission at ILSR is to reinvigorate democracy by decentralizing economic power. Instead, we rely on you, our listeners. Your donations not only underwrite this podcast, but also help us produce all of the research and resources that we make available on our website, and all of the technical assistance we provide to grassroots organizations. Every year, ILSR's small staff helps hundreds of communities challenge monopoly power directly and rebuild their local economies. So please take a minute and go to ilsr.org and click on the donate button. And if making a donation isn't something you can do, please consider helping us in other ways. You can help other folks find this podcast by telling them about it, or by giving it a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. The more ratings from listeners like you, the more folks can find this podcast and ILSR's other podcasts, Community Broadband Bits, and Building Local Power. Thanks again for listening. Now, back to the program. I also wanted to talk about as well, though, so there have been some kind of policy reform efforts, and there are two that I'm interested in getting your thoughts on. One is this energy reform law, 1121, that some folks are calling the Puerto Rican Green New Deal. It includes a provision for 100% renewable energy, and I think you alluded to this earlier, but that it's out several decades in the future. So I'm curious, number one, about how that law might help now in the short term with this issue of resiliency and clean energy. And then the second one was that in the last 5 years, the island's government has established an energy bureau charged with overseeing PREPA. And it seems, in this conversation about making sure the utility is accountable, that is perhaps the most successful thing already, that it has already done things to help hold the utility accountable, and most recently released some rules for microgrids, which are small grids that can be run by a community that can either operate independently or they can operate in connection with the larger grid. And it seems to me that both this new law and these regulations from the Energy Bureau that is overseeing the utility could offer some near-term opportunities. And I'm curious what your perspective is on those.
These are two good questions. It's a bill waiting for the signature of the governor, I understand. It has some good things because it establishes a mandate for 100% renewable, even though I think it's a little bit far in 2050. And also it intends to facilitate the process to adopt more solar power and renewables in general. So there are some positive aspects into this. I am disappointed, though, that the short action that is needed for what I have called the 200,000 families that spend more than 5 months without power is not included in this bill, and that is something that should be the part of the energy public policy. Also, this bill leaves the door open for a potential large investment in natural gas infrastructure as a transition to 100% solar, and that is also worrisome because we might not do the best investments if we go too much into build new gas infrastructure. If we're really trying to go 100% solar in a few decades, when this infrastructure might last another 50, 60 years. And also, while there has been more talk about utility scale solar and utility scale storage, I don't see enough prioritization of rooftop solar. That also gets reflected in the IRP by PREPA that includes a good amount of utility solar systems, but not the rooftop solar. And again, this is where we need to start. We need to start with the rooftops. I call it the bottom-up grid approach. We need to build a new power grid from the bottom, starting in the rooftops of the houses and business and industry, then look at what we can do at community level. For example, for houses, maybe there's some community centers that should be empowered with these kind of systems. And at community level also, we could build microgrids that reinforce what already exists in maybe many houses, but maybe not all of them can have a solar system for infrastructure problems or shading or things like that, and a microgrid can help with that. And if you go up the bottom-up grid, maybe by the time you get to look at mini-grids, if you already have a strong system, the mini-grids might not make economic sense, the kind of investment needed if you already have so many rooftop systems and also microgrids. One problem with this approach is that the big companies that install big system, major projects like $1.5 billion generator, if they want to make money with solar rooftop, then you need to have hundreds of thousands of small projects, and that's not as good for these kind of big companies. However, it is good for small companies in Puerto Rico that do these kind of installations. So I see it as a win-win, but it could create a problem with those interests. about the microgrid development in the island, and there is a new rules, and now I believe that the interconnection rules, there is a draft released last month, so it's under review. So that's moving forward, and I think that's great. These are the steps in the right direction, and we need to enable communities to be able to establish microgrids and maybe also find different ways to establish microgrids. However, again, I think that's not the place to start. We need to start with the rooftops that exist now, and that can be done now without further regulations or rules. And we need to find a way that as we add rooftop solar with batteries in thousands, in hundreds of thousands of houses, that those resources could be then used when we build the microgrid at that level. And perhaps one of the things that I want to research the next couple of years is how to use the solar rooftop with batteries as a precursor of the microgrid, and not make it a competition between, well, if this community, they have solar rooftop and this one have microgrids. No, how can we massively deploy solar rooftop system with batteries and then connect them in the microgrid way to make the system more robust? Because in the end, what we want to do is keep the lights on. And from then on, then we are talking about getting to the future of prosumer, transactive energy, and peer-to-peer energy that could be tested in Puerto Rico if we have this massive level of distributed capacity for generation and for storage. So again, this could be a good opportunity to cover a vulnerability that is very much needed in the rural areas of Puerto Rico, to leapfrog and go to the next grid or the next energy system that we should have in other places. But here, because of the abundance of solar, the high cost of power from the grid, and the vulnerability to hurricanes, could help to do the transition faster. And also considering that we have an aging infrastructure, the generation fleet of PREPA is about 30 years older than in the U.S. So something I say is that it's like we're driving a Toyota Corolla from the 1980s. These are our fleet. But if we're going to go through a transition that is going to make obsolete all the roads, and now all the cars are going to fly, for us to stop driving the little car from the 80s, we're not going to be losing as much as if we just have a brand new Chevy, which might be the new natural gas infrastructure. So I think we are in a good position, because we have aging infrastructure, to make the transition faster and more direct to renewables.
Well, Marcel, I just want to make sure folks know we will have a link to the paper that you've put together on Choles, on the lost hours of electricity, and on this focus on those 200,000 most vulnerable customers, the microgrid regulations, the bill, the 100% renewable bill 1121, which is possible will be signed by Governor Rosselló before we publish this. I'll also share an article that I wrote about a year and a half ago, kind of giving some of that big picture background about the colonial past and present of Puerto Rico. Thank you so much for sharing your vision for how Puerto Rico can recover from Maria and invest in the local communities and in rooftop solar. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and I hope that this conversation continues, because this is, I see as a long-term fight. It's always going to be difficult, but I think this energy fight in Puerto Rico is one that we can win, and we can win it for the benefit of the people that need it the most.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again, Marcel. It was a pleasure talking to you, and also meeting you in San Juan a couple of weeks ago, and I look forward to hearing more about your work in the coming months and years.
Thank you, and I look forward to work more with you and maybe some members of your audience.
This is John Farrell, Director of ILSR's Energy Democracy Initiative. I was speaking with Marcel Castro Sitiriche, Co-director of Cohemis at the University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez, about the island's efforts to build a clean energy system that works for everyone. This podcast is an excerpt of a longer conversation with Marcel for ILSR's Building Local Power podcast, available on our website. Check it out to hear more about Marcel's particular project focusing on the most vulnerable residents of Puerto Rico, as well as more about the island's troubling colonial past and present. On the show page, you'll also find a transcript, a link to Marcel's project on choles, the island's new microgrid regulations, Bill 1121 for 100% renewable energy, and a commentary I published for Green Tech Media back in late 2017, summarizing the challenges facing Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. While you're at our website, you can also find more than 70 past episodes of the Local Energy Rules podcast. Until next time, keep your energy local, and thanks for listening.